Let's not forget this is a Sharia-client state of Iran that has housed Hamas for years, members of Al-Qaeda, enabled the Taliban. These are not our friends.
Welcome back to On Deadline, the Washington Examiner's political game show. I'm Christian Datoc.
And I'm Tiana Lowe Doescher.
Each week, we bring you the biggest political headlines, deliver our takes, and then you get to vote on a winner at the end. Don't forget to like this episode, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. We're starting Above the Fold. It's a segment where we both get a minute to talk about the biggest stories on our plates every single week. Tiana, what are you looking at today?
In 2010, Democrats lost 6 Senate seats and 63 seats in the House of Representatives, the single largest loss for either party since before World War II. And it was because Nancy Pelosi said, "We're here to get a job done, not keep a job." And Barack Obama entered office saying that he was going to fundamentally transform America, and that he did. At the start of the century, only about 3 in 10 Americans were on some form of federally sponsored health insurance. Today, post-ACA's Medicaid expansion, the majority of Americans are on socialized health care. Obama did better than any actual proponent of Medicare for All ever could dream of. Now Republicans have a once-in-a-generation chance to roll this back and roll back one of the fastest growing portions of the federal government. We can just say, getting rid of or imposing work requirements for able-bodied Medicaid recipients, about 20 million of them, that would cut $140 billion in 10 years. Taking non-citizens off of entitlements, that's $1 trillion you can generate. Banning the Medicaid provider gimmick tax would save $720 billion over 10 years. Now is the time. Political capital is meant for something. So will Republicans take this moment of passing the one big beautiful bill to do it? Because we know, Christian, as that score came out, we have about at least $5 trillion they have to pay for.
Yeah, I think the big top line number is giving some of these fiscal hawks obviously major concerns. But to your point, Republicans hold both chambers, although they are slim majorities. Donald Trump has been talking about for months, this needs to happen and it needs to happen now. So I mean, ultimately, what's the holdup? Are we just going to get 2014 Republican efforts to repeal ACA that fail, or are Republicans truly worse at corralling their caucus and being effective governors than the Democrats are?
Part of the reason why the focus has been on Medicaid is because Donald Trump explicitly has ran twice in a row saying, I protect entitlements, I protect your Social Security and your Medicare. So we're just looking at Medicaid, and we're looking only at, they're not taking the Tiana Lowe Scrooge McDuck hatchet that I would. Something like making sure that, so when Medicaid was originally passed by LBJ, it was meant for the severely disabled, extremely poor children, pregnant mothers to make sure you don't have mother dies and child winds up in an orphanage. And it only got expanded to include able-bodied adults with Obamacare. And what he did was he said, we will cover 100% of the costs of these able-bodied adults compared to disabled blind child who only gets about a 50% match in some states. So, for instance, one of the propositions would say, just make it so that way the federal government spends at least as much as it does on the nation's most vulnerable population as it does for these able-bodied adults who are on the Medicaid Obamacare expansion. That would reduce the deficit by $710 over the decade. So none of these are very radical propositions. The Medicare provider tax gimmick is just another way of enriching the insurance companies. So it doesn't make much sense why Republicans are running away from this unless you just literally view your entire political identity as Democrats bad and we don't like woke, and what are we voting you into a majority for? Don't get me wrong, I love tax cuts. The bigger this thing gets and the less control there is behind it, it seems like Republicans are just getting scared of actually having to do it. Well, and where is Nancy Pelosi circa 2012 for Republicans? Where you say, yeah, you know what, for these SALT terrorists that want to increase the state and local tax deduction cap to, they won't tell us the number, but where does Johnson say, we voted you to do a job, not to keep a job?
Yeah. That's interesting. I think, to your point about Mike Johnson and Nancy Pelosi, they are very different speakers in terms of how they can control their caucus. I'm actually surprised that Johnson has made it in this position this far, given how rocky it was in the beginning. But I want to pick up on that line you just mentioned, the Republicans versus Democrats thing, because Donald Trump on Monday, he announced this new drug pricing proposal. It's very aggressive. I actually really like it, and it's something Democrats have been talking about for the better part of the last 20 to 30 years in terms of directly lowering costs for American consumers. But is part of the problem just that the goalposts keep moving? Should Donald Trump just say, hey, I know I have all these ideas, but we have to pass something? Ultimately, that's got to come from either the president or the speaker, right? Otherwise, the bill is just going to keep evolving and mutating until it's at a point where it truly is impassable, no?
And you have Jason Smith leading Ways and Means, who's probably like the closest thing we have to like the real bean counter figuring all this out. But you don't have anyone with you don't have a Kevin Brady or a Paul Ryan this time around that has a very cogent vision for what the reform was, right? Like, we all enjoyed the tax cuts, but the real benefit of the TCJA was making it simpler for 9 out of 10 Americans. Now just take that increased standard deduction, and then those of whom have children also the added child tax credit, to make it really easy, right? Like, a lot of people that used to have to hire accountants or waste a lot of time on TurboTax, they can just use the e-file on the federal government's website. There is no one with that vision. It is basically take a series of campaign slogans Trump used to win Nevada and put it all together and try and make the score equal 0 for reconciliation. Like, it's the president's bill, right? Trump got all the credit for Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and that was a good bill, and he correctly got credit for it. So he should be wanting to preserve that, right? I once again, the stakes are heading, if you do not get this bill passed, it's you head into a midterm election year of 2026 with the majority of Americans receiving a tax hike with an average tax hike of $2,000 per American. And that's not even to mention the added complexity of a bunch of people who got used to just going onto e-file saying, standard deduction, I have 2 kids, done, versus having to go through and itemize every single cost. Christian, what do you see on the upside above the fold?
Well, it was a very big week for Donald Trump, the deal maker in chief. He signed trade deals with both the UK and China, but why does it feel like we didn't really get anything in return? Well, let's look at the deals themselves. With the UK, we got the lowering of the reciprocal tariff rate. The 10% flat tariff is still in effect. The UK says they're going to be opening up their markets for US ag products, specifically beef, and the United States is dropping its steel tariffs in order to receive quotas from the nationalized steel mill in the UK. On China, there's even fewer details. We're dropping those reciprocal rates for 90 days so that the two sides can try and work something out. It doesn't really sound like much of a deal to me. And it's not just trade. Donald Trump took credit for the ceasefire between India and Pakistan, which broke down just a few hours later. Look, Donald Trump right now in his career, he is concerned with getting himself on Mount Rushmore. He's going to tout these semi-deals as big-time wins and let the regular people, you and me, hang in the dust and just deal with the consequences. He needs to put up or shut up. To your point, stick with a coherent viewpoint for what these tariffs and what his foreign policy is supposed to achieve, and just stick to it rather than changing his mind every other day.
So on the one hand, the uncertainty is what has driven so much of just the chaos in not just the stock market, but also the bond market, dollar index, all of that. On the other hand, it is good objectively to have a president that responds to public opinion, right? To an extent, because sometimes it goes so far that Trump says no tax on tips, even though that doesn't really do anything macroeconomically, but it sounds nice and people like it and you get applause. On the other hand, when the bond markets are saying you will suicide the American economy if you put, a 46% tariff on Vietnam, then there's okay, we're going to get a 90-day pause. And so luckily, the most important thing that I think we're seeing early, right after the opening bell on Monday and in those like pre-market trading hours, is that we are no longer getting that weird market movement where everything's going down at the same time, a la emerging markets. Like now, like even though bonds are going up, bond yields are going up, so that means the value of the bonds are going down because they move inverse. the dollar index is strengthening upon this news. And that is a very, very good sign, because there was like a solid month there where the markets were behaving like we were, a third world post-communist economy, which you do not want the US economy to feel like. Some of these deals are products of some very good back and forth, right? Like the Ukraine mineral deal, it's incredible how little attention that got, because that was a very good sign of triangulation. Bessent saying, we never wanted to decouple from the Chinese economy. Okay, that is completely divorced from the rhetoric we've heard for the last 3 months. So the reason why I'm not totally pessimistic on the China deal is not just because the markets absolutely love it. It's because the long-term incentive structure bodes well for Trump. Not just in the sense that a lot of our allies have been moving away from China for a very long time. During his first administration, you saw companies like Nike move from China to Vietnam. But also, the long-term trajectory of Chinese markets, they need us more than we need them in the long term, right? There was always supposed to be the Chinese century when Chinese GDP was supposed to supersede American GDP. That number was that was supposed to happen in 2020, then it got, postponed to 2030, and now will probably never happen at all, because we account for 3% of their GDP right now, and the Chinese population is just tanking, right? They've had 3 successive years of population decline. So it's possible that like the Chinese century isn't even a Chinese decade, it just never happens at all. So they need us more than we need them. The issue, honestly, I think, and I realize the markets don't agree with me here, is the UK deal that keeps that 10% floor. And I think it might be a little bit of cope. It might be a little accurate to say it's just a framework. We're keeping the 10% in while we work on all the other deals, and then maybe the 10% goes away. But I guess I fail to see what advantage there is. Goldman saying that this 90-day deal with China amounts to what? I think it's a 2% reduction.
Drop in the effective tariff rate, yeah.
What does it matter if we keep 10% minimum tariffs on all of our allies, including those like the UK, with whom we have a trade surplus, which again is not necessarily a good thing, but it's what Trump claims to care about.
Well, you threw a lot of, numbers and economic mumbo jumbo at me
I'm
right
still
here,
processing
which I'm not.
it.
I'm not disagreeing with, but I think you sort of illustrated my point, right?
Yeah.
We've heard a lot of lines from the White House about what these tariffs are actually supposed to achieve. And sure, there are differences between the sectoral tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs, but to your point, Donald Trump taking his, indicators from public sentiment, from the stock market, from the bond yield, shows that he's not really committed to, one, revitalizing U.S. steel manufacturing as a means of bolstering national security. He's not committed to reshoring those manufacturing jobs from China or Vietnam or anywhere else in Southeast Asia to boost heartland communities again that have gone away post-Great Depression, right? I think he has no idea what he's doing. If he was committed to a specific policy line, and even if it was 3 specific policy lines for each of the different types of tariffs he's employing, we wouldn't get these immediate deals, as Fox News is reporting that the majority of American small businesses are at the end of their inventory.
Yeah.
And they're totally hosed heading into next month because, it costs almost 1.5 times as much to import their stock from
also,
China.
we'll keep tabs on these ports as these ships come in. A lot of these ships are empty.
Yeah.
Or the inventory amount is like, half of what it used to be, because these things take time. There's a long trickle effect. It's why I'm not giving too much credence to like the April macroeconomic data, because these small businesses, they are not thinking in terms of what will Trump tweet next. But now they kind of have to. But that's not how the shipping world works.
No, it's not how the shipping world works. It's not how finance works. And I think that's sort of what people are missing. We're trying to attribute real math and real theory to what's happening.
Yeah.
But in reality, the economists and the traders, they're missing the fact that this is just politics from Trump.
Yeah.
It was framed as policy, trying to fundamentally reshape the entire global system. But in practicality, it's purely politics. He's throwing stuff at the wall to see what works, and he's trying to keep voters happy and, again, boost his own legacy because he only has 3 years in office at this point in time. We joked about, people are telling me to run for 2028. He's now come out and said, no, I'm not doing this. I'm focused on right now because I'm leaving office soon. And again, he wants to get on Mount Rushmore. That doesn't mean anything for the rest of the country, though. So I guess we'll just have to see where we go from here.
Time for yays and nays when we give our opinion on the news of the week. Sometimes we'll agree, other times we'll disagree.
Pope Leo can make the Vatican a political force once again.
Can is the operable word here. Can I punt and say maybe? I'll say yes. I'll say he can.
Okay.
I say he can do that. That was sort of a softer no. You seem a little worried.
Okay, so I need to caveat this with, I am not Catholic, I'm Eastern Orthodox, and we regard the Pope as the Bishop of Rome. He's the first among equals, but he's not supposed to have the same temporal power that Catholics regard him as. So I'm coming at this from what some may perceive to be extremely biased. But I'm not grounding my answer in theology, I'm going to ground it in history.
Okay.
So the Pope wound up gaining much of its political power, much of the office's political power for territorial reasons, but also the existence of the Holy Roman Empire. For centuries throughout the Middle Ages, there was a debate: is the Pope supreme over the Holy Roman Emperor or vice versa? Because the Holy Roman Emperor is crowned by the Pope. The Pope remained extremely powerful, probably reached the peak of his political power at the same time that he was criticized for the most amount of corruption, right? So before the Reformation, when you have Pope Alexander VI consolidate control of the papal states, so that would be what we think of as most of Italy, that sets the precedent for what would become the Reformation, because you have a lot of corruption at the time. Martin Luther has his theses, and then from there you have a bunch of breakaway, and at the same time during the Renaissance, a lot of nationalization. The Pope manages to cling on to power for a decent amount of time, but then finally, with the unification of Italy in the late 1800s, that's when the Pope gets resigned to just the Vatican, and that's when really the Pope loses the thrust of his political power. But since then, it hasn't all remained the same, because you had during World War II, Pius the 12th. There are a lot
It's hard to keep track of all those Piuses, you know?
Pius the 12th was arguably, I would say, a very bad pope.
Okay.
In terms of his silence at best with the Nazis and complicity at worst with the Croatian genocide that so it was called the Ustashi, and I know it very well because it was perpetrated against the Serbs during World War II, and so that's where my family is from. The opposite of Pius the 12th would be John Paul II, who was extremely instrumental during the Cold War in helping break down the fortitude of communism, right? But more than exercising temporal power, he did not focus on what he could actually do, but rather on what he could say. So I think it calls into question, where is a pope's strength and scale? So Pius the 12th's defenders will always say he remained silent, that way behind the scenes he could be a political actor. That meant that he lost all of his moral authority. And in my opinion, this is clearly where I'm very orthodox, I care more about the moral authority of a religious leader than their temporal power. Because as a president isn't necessarily a moral authority, nor do they have to be, because they only have however many millions of citizens. The Pope is in charge of over 1 billion people, if you include us Orthodox, who regard him as the Bishop of Rome. We do regard him as a moral authority. You're talking 2 billion people and growing, especially because you saw it continued under Pope Francis, massive amounts of expansion into Africa, into Asia, and that's great. Where Pope Leo, I think, could be a crucial moral authority won't just be continuing what he's already done, hopefully bringing this younger generation that seems to really be attracted to the style of the high church and the Latin Mass and the vestments that this Pope seems to really embrace. I would also hope the religious crackdown in China that Francis was very bad about, right? Francis was just I'd rather just get my foot in the door in China and let there be way more domestic dissent of my adherents. And this is where none of this is to say that I don't think that Pope Leo could be a formidable leader, but it's that I think it matters more if he wants to be a moral leader than if he wants to be a political one, because after the unification of Italy, the Pope being a political leader has not been effective. being a moral leader is what matters because you have 2 billion followers.
That was illuminating. I appreciate the history lesson because the background I'm pulling from doesn't go nearly back that long. I'm going to restrict myself to this millennium, to be quite honest. And look, I think Pope Leo has an opportunity here. I don't think he will necessarily become a political scion on the global scale, like we talked about those pre-unification popes were. But I do think, specifically in this moment in American politics, he has a real chance to move the Republican Party on one specific issue, and I think it's immigration. I'm glad you brought up the attractiveness of the Catholic Church to a lot of these young conservative voters because of the vestments and because of the tradition. Pope Leo, from everything that I can gather, is significantly more traditional when it comes to administering the Mass in Latin and wearing the proper garb and all that than Pope Francis was. Let's be honest, coming from Chicago too, you have to imagine people are probably going to pay more attention to him than Francis, who was from Argentina, or John Paul, who was from Germany, I want to say, right? And
before that, you had a string of 500 consecutive popes who were from Italy. Fun facts.
Bellissima. No, but seriously, I think the fact that, again, I didn't do a thorough review of all of Pope Leo's past statements over the weekend. I did see that he loved the White Sox in 2005 and was at the World Series. Again, I think this could help him relate to American audiences.
Bob from the South Side.
But the only comment that we've seen surfaced is him, sort of tut-tutting J.D. Vance on Twitter. He has weighed in on this one issue. And I think much in the same way that we sort of drown out Democrats with Trump derangement syndrome, crying that the sky is falling every time Donald Trump gets out of bed, Pope Francis lost a little bit of that moral authority with Americans when he was when he weighed in on virtually every facet of American politics. It's really early, but again, just this convergence of factors, quite literally the fact that he's American, obviously, loves baseball, the relationship with the largest growing subset of the Republican Party in relation to the Catholic Church. There is a bridge that there is a divide that he can bridge. We'll just have to see if he can actually get through to folks. Now it's time for us to fill in the blank.
Qatar's growing friendliness in Washington is concerning because of blank.
The obvious reasons, I guess. I mean, let's sort of back up for a second and set the stage for our viewers. Over the weekend, there was a huge story that broke from ABC and has since been confirmed by the Trump administration that the Qataris are just straight up giving Donald Trump a $400 million private jumbo jet.
A palace in the sky.
Exactly. It does look pretty good, I'm not going to lie.
Yeah.
He has talked about wanting to, get a new Air Force One for years. Boeing is decades late on their procurement order. So, this is obviously raising red flags, but it's not just with Donald Trump. The Qataris are one of the most powerful lobbies in Washington of any foreign country, and they're targeting folks on both sides of the aisle, and they've been doing it for years. It's obviously concerning, given their relationship with terror groups in the Middle East, given their treatment of their own people, their use of slave labor on massive infrastructure projects. It's strange, but it's also kind of comforting at this point that it's happening out in the open. Donald Trump really is the most transparent president ever, I guess. It's like asking, the family of Jamal Khashoggi, are you worried that MBS is going to send you a brand new private jet? It just feels weird, right? I don't know.
I mean, the top line is that it's concerning because Iran. Despite, we repeatedly get told by Steve Witkoff, the Qataris are our allies.
Well, I think it's important to recognize that everybody may want something. I think in the case of the Qataris, they're criticized for not being well motivated. It's preposterous. They are well motivated. They're good, decent people. What they want is a mediation that's effective, that gets to a peace goal. And why? Because they're a small nation and they want to be acknowledged as a peacemaker.
Let's not forget this is a Sharia client state of Iran that has housed Hamas for years, members of Al-Qaeda, enabled the Taliban. These are not our friends. And unlike the Saudi example is very important because Saudi Arabia, it is an illiberal country pursuing liberal ends. You have MBS, who is an enlightened despot, who's willing to, use incredibly carceral, cruel means in order to achieve things like women having the ability to drive and work and go to school. Whereas Qatar is using a flashy facade to further entrench Sharia, to further entrench its ties to terror and terror proxies. So the main reason imminently why we should be concerned with this story beyond like the obvious corruption, which again, Democrats, this is why you needed to take the Hunter Biden stuff more seriously, because now you don't have much political cover to care about this Trump stuff. But like from a self-interested perspective, recall Qatar gets money from Iran. They have a very close relationship. What foreign power has tried to assassinate Donald Trump before?
Let me think. I think it might rhyme with Tehran, perhaps? I can't really remember, yeah.
Maybe it would. Do you really want to be in a plane, even if it is retrofitted? Like, I would never trust a plane that was once owned by the Qataris. You don't know how many members of Hamas have been in this plane. We could go on. But the other issue with Qatar, so you pointed out they're one of the biggest donors to DC. Mm-hmm. It is not just DC. Qatar is the single largest foreign donor to the American university system, to the tune of more than $2 billion just in the last 4 years.
That's more insidious than just giving Trump a plane, in my opinion.
Oh, 100%. Mm-hmm. And like also, we can blame Boeing, which is effectively, a nationalized industry that has been allowed to coast and be terrible. Remember, Trump originally ordered a new Air Force One in 2018, and they're saying they'll have one 11 years after that, 2029. Yeah. So like, I understand the concern with the plane. Air Force One is old. You can probably attest more to like the operational factors of it. But really, Qatar's motivation is concerning because we are in a Cold War that apparently nobody wants to actually address. And that, I am not a neocon. I am not a war hawk. I do not want this to ever turn into a hot war, because it is a hot war against nuclear powers. But the fact is that when Iran is debating, oh, do we sign a new JCPOA, aka Obama Deal 2.0, they send over their envoys to talk to the Russians and to the Chinese. The Qataris, yeah, it's wonderful and incredible that we are reportedly getting the last American hostage held by Hamas in Gaza. But why are the rest of the hostages still being held? If the Qataris have the power to get one American hostage, they have the power to get the rest. It is a policy decision that they have allowed Hamas to stay in power. So there's just, I think, a willful delusion among, I would just call it the Witkoff faction within the White House, that thinks, oh, Iran, Qatar, Russia, China, they are not all working together, when clearly they are. They're telling us that. They're not exactly hiding the ball. And yet, like, we all have to engage in this folie à deux, pretending that they're not.
Are you telling me that the deal maker in chief and his most trusted lieutenants aren't going to negotiate this Cold War down from where it currently is? I find that hard to believe. It's almost like we're coming full circle from the very first segment. Who knows?
Let us know who you think won this week's clash. And in the meantime, don't forget to subscribe, like this video, share it with your friends, and check us out next week. I'm Tiana Lowe Doescher.
And I'm Christian Datoc.
And this has been On Deadline.